August 15th, 1930. 352 East 116th Street, East Harlem, New York. 10 o'clock in the evening. Giuseppe Morello sat at a wooden desk in his second-floor office, counting cash receipts from his grocery business. Bills lay in neat stacks before him. Ones, fives, tens, the day's earnings from legitimate commerce. His deformed right hand, the one with only a single finger that resembled a claw, moved methodically through the money. He'd been counting cash for decades, though in earlier years it had been counterfeit bills fresh from printing plates smuggled from Sicily. Now, at 63, he ran groceries and bakeries, quiet businesses for a man whose name once made bankers and politicians nervous across 3 states. 2 associates sat nearby, Joseph Periano and Gaspare Polaro, discussing something in low voices, relaxed, unguarded. No weapons drawn, no bodyguards posted, just 3 men in an office finishing the day's business. The door burst open. 2 gunmen, faces set, pistols raised. At least a dozen shots exploded in rapid succession, muzzle flashes illuminating the small office. Periano hit multiple times, stumbled toward the window, and jumped, falling 20 feet to the rear doorway below, where he died on impact or shortly after. Polaro took bullets but remained conscious, crawling towards safety. Morello, the primary target, was struck in the head and body. He staggered into an adjacent room, blood filling his throat, and collapsed. By the time he hit the floor, Giuseppe the Clutch Hand Morello, the man who built America's first mafia family, who brought Sicilian criminal traditions to New York streets, who ruled as the first boss of bosses, was dead. This is the story of how one man with a deformed hand and a criminal education from Corleone created the template for every mafia family that would follow. How he turned extortion into an industry, counterfeiting into an art, and murder into a message. How he built an organization so influential that its descendants, the Genovese crime family, still operate today, more than a century after its founding. And how the man who pioneered the American mafia died the way so many after him would. Betrayed, outmaneuvered, shot down in a war he helped start but couldn't finish. May 2nd, 1867. Corleone, Sicily. A stone house in a mountain town 50 kilometers inland from Palermo. Angelina Piazza Morello gave birth to a son. They named him Giuseppe. But when the midwife unwrapped his hands, she saw immediately that something was wrong. The boy's right hand was malformed. The fingers curled together into a small knot, with only the 4th finger identifiable, bent like a claw. In the superstitious culture of 19th century Sicily, such deformities carried meaning. Omens of misfortune, signs of God's displeasure, marks that set a child apart. The adults whispered. The other children would stare. And Giuseppe Morello, before he could walk or talk, already bore a physical mark that would define how people saw him for the rest of his life. His father, Calogero Morello, died when Giuseppe was only 5 years old. The cause isn't recorded: disease, accident, violence, all common in Sicily's harsh rural interior, where life expectancy was short and medical care virtually non-existent. Angelina found herself widowed with young children in a society that offered few options for women alone. Within a year, she remarried. Her new husband was Bernardo Terranova, a man connected to the Corleonese Mafia. It was a strategic match. Terranova provided protection, income, status. And he brought Giuseppe and his sister Maria into a world where the Mafia wasn't an abstraction or a distant threat. It was family. Corleone in the 1870s was Mafia territory. The organization had evolved from rural bandits and estate guards into something more sophisticated. A parallel government that mediated disputes, enforced contracts, provided protection, and extracted tribute from anyone doing business in their territory. Young Giuseppe watched how it worked, how men came to Terranova seeking justice when the official courts were too slow, too corrupt, or too distant, how disputes over land or debts were resolved not by law, but by the word of respected men who commanded fear and loyalty in equal measure, how violence, when necessary, was swift and absolute, a tool used not in rage but as policy. Bernardo and Angelina had more children, sons named Vincenzo, Cero, and Niccolò, daughters named Lucia, Salvatrice, and Rosalia. The Morello and Terranova children grew up together, and Bernardo likely facilitated Giuseppe's early induction into the local mafia clan. Giuseppe also had an uncle, Giuseppe Battaglia, who was a leader in the Corleonese Mafia. The family connections were deep, the criminal education thorough. By his 20s, Giuseppe Morello was deeply enmeshed in Corleone's criminal networks, trusted and dangerous in local circles, though contemporary records do not clearly document a formal induction rite. Around 1889, at age 22, Giuseppe married Maria Rosa Marsalisi. They had 2 children, a daughter, Angela, who died in infancy in 1892, and a son, Calogero, born in November 1892. Around this time, Giuseppe became involved in counterfeiting. It was a lucrative crime, especially in a cash economy, where verification was difficult and penalties were harsh, but enforcement was weak. Morello ran a counterfeiting ring in Corleone, printing fake currency and distributing it through networks of merchants and criminal associates. But someone talked. Police became aware of the operation. And around the same time, Morello became a suspect in a murder, possibly a witness killed to protect the counterfeiting ring, possibly an unrelated mafia matter. The details are lost to history. What's certain is that in 1892, Giuseppe Morello fled Sicily for America. Despite his departure, the Italian government proceeded with prosecution. On September 14, 1894, Morello was tried in absentia and found guilty of counterfeiting. He was sentenced to 6 years and 45 days in prison, fined and deprived of the right to hold public office. The sentence couldn't touch him in America, but it ensured he could never return to Sicily without facing arrest. Giuseppe Morello had burned his bridges. America was now his only home. The voyage across the Atlantic in steerage class was brutal. Packed into cramped, poorly ventilated spaces below deck, hundreds of Italian immigrants endured weeks of seasickness, disease, and uncertainty. They spoke little English. They carried everything they owned in battered suitcases and cloth bundles. They had heard stories of America, streets paved with gold, opportunities for anyone willing to work, freedom from the rigid class structures and grinding poverty of southern Italy. But they also knew the reality. Most would end up in tenements, working brutal hours in factories or construction, barely scraping by while landlords and bosses exploited their desperation and language barriers. Morello arrived in New York in 1892. His family followed in March 1893. His mother Angelina, stepfather Bernardo, his wife Maria Rosa, and son Calogero, his half-brothers Vincenzo, Cero, and Niccolò, and his sisters. They settled initially in Manhattan's Lower East Side, where Italian immigrants clustered in tenements around Mulberry Street, Mott Street, and Elizabeth Street. The neighborhood was chaos, push carts clogging narrow streets, children playing in gutters, the smell of cooking mixing with sewage and coal smoke, languages and dialects from every corner of Italy and Eastern Europe creating a cacophony that never stopped. Some accounts record a brief period in the mid-1890s when the family tried seasonal work in the American South, Louisiana and Texas, before returning to New York. Sources vary on duration and details. By 1897, Giuseppe and his half-brothers Vincenzo, Ciro, and Niccolo had relocated to East Harlem, settling in the neighborhood around 107th Street. The area was heavily Italian, especially Sicilian, with recent immigrants living in cramped tenements and working wherever they could find employment. Morello saw opportunity. He founded what would become known as the 107th Street Mob, recruiting young Italian men, establishing relationships with local business owners, and implementing the protection rackets he'd learned in Sicily. The system was simple and effective. Morello's men would visit a shop or business owned by an Italian immigrant. They'd explain, politely at first, that the neighborhood was dangerous. Robberies, vandalism, fires. These things happened to unprotected businesses. But for a weekly fee, $5, $10, whatever the business could afford, Morello's organization would ensure nothing bad happened. And if the owner refused, well, the dangers that had been hypothetical suddenly became very real. Windows shattered, inventory disappeared, sometimes worse. Most paid. Those who didn't learned quickly. This was Black Hand extortion, named for the symbol of a black hand that often appeared on threatening letters. The technique had been used in southern Italy for decades, but Morello and his associates refined it for New York's immigrant communities. The letters were sent anonymously, demanding cash, sometimes large sums in high-profile cases, but often amounts varied widely, from modest sums that could cripple a shopkeeper up to thousands in exceptional cases. The threats were explicit: pay or face kidnapping, bombing, murder. Many victims paid rather than risk their families. Others went to the police. But language barriers, distrust of authority, and fear of retaliation made successful prosecutions rare. The Black Hand became a terror campaign that funded Morello's growing empire. In 1902, Morello acquired a saloon at 8 Prince Street in Manhattan. It became the gang's official headquarters, a place where members could meet without drawing police attention, where plans could be made behind closed doors, where tribute could be collected and distributed. The saloon was also where Morello met other key figures in New York's emerging Italian underworld, including a man who would become both his brother-in-law and his most dangerous enforcer, Ignazio Saietta, known to everyone as Lupo the Wolf. Ignazio Lupo was born in Palermo in March 1877. He'd worked in his father's grocery business until 1898, when he killed a local businessman during a dispute and fled to New York. Lupo quickly established himself as a ruthless operator in Little Italy, running protection rackets and extortion schemes with a level of violence that shocked even hardened criminals. Lupo earned a reputation for brutality and was linked in press and police accounts to numerous murders. Estimates in later accounts vary widely and are not all court-proven. His method of disposing of bodies became infamous. He would dismember victims, stuff the remains into large wooden barrels, and dump them in the ocean, leave them on street corners, or ship them to other cities with false address labels. In December 1903, Lupo married Morello's half-sister Salvatrice Terranova. The marriage wasn't just romantic, it was strategic. It solidified the alliance between Morello's East Harlem operation and Lupo's Little Italy network, creating the most powerful Italian criminal organization in New York. Morello controlled East Harlem and parts of the Bronx. Lupo controlled Little Italy. Together, they dominated Manhattan's Italian underworld. Historians debate whether they led separate families or a unified organization, but contemporaries saw them as partners, with Morello as the strategic leader and Lupo as the violent enforcer. Around the same time, another key figure entered Morello's orbit: Vito Cascioferro, a Sicilian mafioso with connections to Italy's most powerful criminal networks. Some contemporaneous reports and memoirs link Cascioferro with New York Sicilian networks, during the early 1900s and suggest he aided or advised on criminal operations, including counterfeiting techniques, though his direct operational control in New York remains disputed in the record. What is clearer is that Morello was recognized by mafia leaders in other cities as a preeminent Italian boss in America, sometimes referred to as capo di tutti capi, boss of bosses, to oversee operations and resolve disputes between different cities' Italian criminal families. It was a title that carried immense prestige and immense danger. Morello's counterfeiting operations became increasingly sophisticated. In 1903, his organization launched an operation involving high-quality $5 bills, with some accounts suggesting the bills were printed abroad using plates and techniques that produced currency difficult to detect. The bills would be smuggled into the United States, where Morello's network would distribute them through carefully selected channels: gambling dens, saloons, brothels, places where cash changed hands quickly, and verification was minimal. The profits were enormous. Morello employed numerous associates in the operation, laundering the proceeds through legitimate businesses, including a real estate company he'd incorporated in 1902 called the Ignaz Florio Cooperative Association among Corleonesi. The cooperative appeared legitimate on paper. It was a banking and real estate company that bought and sold properties in New York, eventually constructing tenement buildings in the Bronx. Shares were sold to Southern Italian immigrants with promises of dividends and profit sharing. The company's directors included Antonio Milone, Marco Macaluso, whose son would later become consigliere of the Lucchese crime family, and Frank Baralatto. But the cooperative was primarily a money laundering vehicle, a way to convert criminal proceeds into legitimate assets. Over time, contractors went unpaid and properties became heavily mortgaged. The association eventually collapsed under liens, foreclosures, and lawsuits, but not before Morello had profited handsomely. April 1903. A barrel was discovered on the sidewalk in Manhattan. Police opened it and found the dismembered remains of a man later identified as Benedetto Madonia, a Buffalo resident who'd been seen with members of the Morello gang the night before. He disappeared. The barrel murder, as newspapers called it, horrified New Yorkers and brought intense scrutiny to Italian organized crime. Police arrested Morello, Lupo, and several associates. Other individuals under suspicion, including those with connections to Sicilian networks, left New York during the investigation. But the prosecution couldn't build a case. Witnesses disappeared or refused to testify. Physical evidence was insufficient. Morello and his associates walked free. The barrel murder, despite widespread coverage, resulted in no convictions. It did, however, establish a pattern. Morello's organization killed without hesitation, disposed of bodies in ways designed to terrorize potential rivals, and operated with apparent impunity because fear kept witnesses silent and police investigations stalled. The counterfeiting operation continued after the barrel murder investigation faded. In March 1899, a letter Morello had sent to a Boston counterfeiting gang was intercepted by the Secret Service, the federal agency responsible for investigating counterfeiting and protecting currency. Morello came under surveillance. In June 1900, he was arrested in connection with a counterfeiting operation, but was released due to insufficient evidence. The Secret Service, however, continued monitoring him. By 1905, Morello had created the largest, most influential Sicilian crime family in New York City. He was recognized by mafia leaders in other cities as the preeminent Italian boss in America. His organization controlled gambling, loan sharking, extortion, labor racketeering, and counterfeiting across Manhattan and the Bronx. His half-brothers Vincenzo, Tiro, and Niccolo served as trusted lieutenants. His brother-in-law Lupo the Wolf ensured that violence was swift and final when diplomacy failed. and young ambitious men were joining the organization, hungry for the wealth and power that came with membership. Men like Giuseppe Mel and Salvatore D'Aquila, who would later become bosses themselves. But the Secret Service was patient. They built their case methodically, tracking the distribution network, identifying the counterfeiters, following the money. In November 1909, federal agents raided a building at Highland, New York, that the Morellos were using as a front for their counterfeiting operation. The raid yielded printing plates, counterfeit bills in various stages of production, and evidence linking Morello and Lupo directly to the operation. The case was airtight. November 15, 1909. Giuseppe Morello and Ignazio Lupo were arrested and charged with counterfeiting. The trial was brief. The evidence was overwhelming. In February 1910, both men were convicted. Morello was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. Lupo received a lengthy sentence as well. The first boss of the American Mafia was going to prison at age 42, and his empire would have to survive without him. Morello would ultimately serve roughly a decade before being paroled in 1920. Morello was sent to Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, a brutal facility in Georgia where conditions were harsh and violence was common. For a boss accustomed to command and respect, prison was humiliation. But Morello adapted. He maintained contact with associates on the outside through coded letters and messages passed by visitors. He received updates on the organization's operations, conflicts with rivals, and power struggles within the leadership. And he watched as younger men he'd mentored or recruited, began positioning themselves to take over. With Morello in prison, leadership of the family passed to his youngest half-brother, Niccolo Terranova. Niccolo, just 20 years old when he took over, lacked his older brother's experience and strategic thinking. The organization continued operating. The extortion rackets, gambling operations, and labor racketeering generated steady income. But without Morello's guiding hand, the family became vulnerable to challenges from rivals. One of those rivals was a Neapolitan boss in Brooklyn named Pellegrino Moreno, who controlled the Camorra, a criminal organization from Naples that competed with the Sicilian Mafia for control of New York's Italian underworld. In 1916, during the Mafia-Camorra War, Morano had Niccolo Terranova murdered. Morello's youngest brother was dead, killed in a war he hadn't started. Leadership passed to Morello's two remaining half-brothers, Vincenzo and Ciro Terranova, who ran the family as co-bosses until Morello's release. But the power vacuum created by Morello's imprisonment had allowed another figure to rise, Salvatore D'Aquila, a Sicilian boss who controlled operations in Brooklyn and parts of Manhattan. D'Aquila was ambitious, calculating, and ruthless. By 1920, when Morello was finally paroled after serving 10 years, D'Aquila had consolidated enough power to declare himself boss of bosses, the same title Morello had held before prison. And D'Aquila made clear that he viewed Morello's return as a threat that needed to be eliminated. March 18, 1920. Giuseppe Morello walked out of Atlanta Federal Penitentiary after serving roughly 10 years of his 25-year sentence. He was 52 years old, grayer, thinner, hardened by a decade in prison, but alive and still dangerous. A few months later, Ignazio Lupo was also paroled. Both men returned to New York expecting to reclaim their positions. Instead, they found a mafia landscape that had changed dramatically. D'Aquila controlled the commission that oversaw New York's mafia families. He had allies in other cities, and he made clear that Morello and Lupo were not welcome. According to later informant testimony, including accounts by Nicola Gentile, D'Aquila convened a meeting of the U.S. Mafia's General Assembly and condemned Morello, Lupo, and several other associates to death. It was a question of power. D'Aquila was asserting authority, and those who didn't support him were marked for elimination. Some informants later suggested Morello briefly sought refuge and allies outside New York when his position was threatened. Accounts differ, and this retreat is not documented uniformly. What is clear is that Morello eventually negotiated a fragile peace with D'Aquila, agreeing to step back from active leadership in exchange for his life. But the humiliation stung. Morello, the man who'd built the first mafia family in America, was now a minor player in an organization he'd created. Around this time, another ambitious figure emerged, Giuseppe Masseria, known as Joe the Boss. Masseria had joined the Morello family as a young man and risen through the ranks during Morello's imprisonment. He was uncouth, brutal, and absolutely fearless. In 1922, a former D'Aquila gunman named Umberto Valenti tried to kill Masseria in a bid to regain D'Aquila's favor. Valenti failed. In May 1922, Morello's half-brother Vincenzo Terranova was shot to death at 116th Street and 2nd Avenue, likely another victim of the ongoing power struggle. But in August 1922, Valenti himself was killed by Masseria gunmen. Some accounts say Charles Lucky Luciano was among the shooters. With Valenti dead, D'Aquila's aura of invincibility began to crack. Masseria grew stronger, and Morello, recognizing that his time as a boss had passed, made a pragmatic decision. He became consigliere, senior advisor to Giuseppe Masseria. It was a demotion in title, but a position of influence. Morello still commanded respect. He understood strategy, politics, the long game. And throughout the 1920s, as Prohibition created unprecedented opportunities for wealth through bootlegging, Morello prospered under Masseria's leadership. The Prohibition era transformed the mafia. Bootlegging was more profitable than any racket that had come before. Millions of dollars flowing through operations that supplied illegal alcohol to a nation that desperately wanted to drink. The Morello Masseria organization expanded into bootlegging, rum running, and speakeasy protection. Younger members like Luciano, Vito Genovese, Frank Costello, and Albert Anastasia rose through the ranks, learning from Morello's strategic thinking and Masseria's brutal pragmatism. But as Masseria's power grew, so did opposition. In October 1928, Salvatore D'Aquila was murdered during a visit to a doctor's office in Manhattan. The assassination was ordered by Masseria, who replaced D'Aquila as the new boss of bosses with Morello as his consigliere. For a brief moment, it seemed like Morello had returned to the top of the underworld hierarchy, advising the most powerful boss in New York. But Masseria's reign created new enemies. Salvatore Maranzano, a Sicilian immigrant from Castellammare del Golfo, who'd arrived in New York in the mid-1920s, quickly built a power base among Castellammari's Sicilians and other factions who resented Masseria's dominance. By 1930, tensions erupted into the Castellammari's War, a bloody conflict for control of New York's mafia. Masseria's faction, including Luciano, Genovese, Anastasia, Costello, and Willie Moretti, battled Maranzano's Castellammari's faction for supremacy. Giuseppe Morello, now 63 years old but still respected for his experience, functioned as an elder advisor to Masseria during this period. He was valued for his strategic thinking and decades of criminal wisdom, though he was not the principal battlefield commander in the war. The war claimed victims quickly. On February 26, 1930, Gaetano Reina, a Masseria ally who controlled the Bronx ice distribution racket, was murdered on orders from Maranzano. In response, Masseria appointed Joseph Pinzolo to take over Reina's operations. But on September 9, 1930, Pinzolo was shot and killed at a Times Square office. The Reina family defected to Maranzano's side. On November 5th, 1930, Alfred Mineo and Steve Ferrigno, key Masseria allies, were murdered, and their gang defected to Maranzano. The war was going badly for Masseria's side. Allies were dying or switching sides. Territory was being lost. But Morello, despite his age and reduced role, remained a symbolic figure within Masseria's faction, a link to the organization's founding, an elder whose presence still carried weight. That made him a target. On the evening of August 15, 1930, Morello went to his office at 352 East 116th Street to collect cash receipts from his grocery businesses. He brought 2 associates, Joseph Periano and Gaspari Polaro, but no bodyguards. None of the 3 men were armed. It was routine business on a Friday night. 2 gunmen forced their way into the second-floor office. Contemporary accounts and later memoirs refer to a killer nicknamed Buster from Chicago, sometimes identified as Sebastiano Domingo. But the gunmen's identities have never been conclusively established. They opened fire immediately, at least a dozen shots. Periano hit multiple times, jumped through a window, and fell more than 20 feet to his death in the rear doorway. Polaro was wounded but survived long enough to describe the attack to police before dying in the hospital. Morello, struck in the head and body, staggered into an adjacent office. He collapsed, choking on his own blood. By the time help arrived, Giuseppe Morello was dead. The man who'd built the first mafia family in America, who'd brought Sicilian traditions of organized crime to New York streets, who'd pioneered counterfeiting networks, barrel murders, and systematic extortion, died on the floor of a shabby office in East Harlem. Betrayed not by law enforcement, but by rivals within the organization he'd helped create. He was 63 years old. His half-brother Vincenzo was already dead. His half-brother Niccolo had been murdered years earlier. Only Ciro Terranova, the artichoke king, remained of the old dynasty, and his power had faded to almost nothing. Police investigated Morello's murder, but never made arrests. The Castellamarese War continued. On April 15, 1931, Giuseppe Masseria was lured to a restaurant in Coney Island by Lucky Luciano. While Luciano excused himself to the bathroom, gunmen rushed in and killed Masseria. Luciano had betrayed his boss in a deal with Maranzano to end the war. Maranzano declared himself boss of bosses and reorganized New York's mafia into 5 families. But his reign lasted only months. In September 1931, Maranzano was murdered on Luciano's orders. Luciano established the Commission, a governing body of mafia families meant to prevent future wars through power sharing and consensus. The Commission was Luciano's institutional solution to the violence of the Castellamarese era. It borrowed and reworked some earlier ideas about centralized arbitration, and Morello's era is part of that genealogical background rather than a direct institutional predecessor. The organization Morello founded evolved into what's known today as the Genovese crime family, named for Vito Genovese, who eventually took control. It's the oldest of New York's 5 families, a direct lineage from the 107th Street mob that Morello established in the 1890s. The methods Morello pioneered, extortion through systematic protection rackets, counterfeiting distributed through criminal networks, strategic violence used to eliminate rivals and terrorize communities, money laundering through legitimate businesses, became standard practice for every mafia family that followed. But Morello's legacy is more than operational techniques. He proved that Sicilian criminal traditions could be transplanted to America and adapted to an urban immigrant environment. He showed that organized crime could operate across city boundaries, coordinating with groups in other states to create a national network. He demonstrated that the mafia didn't need to hide in the shadows. It could operate openly in immigrant neighborhoods where language barriers and fear kept witnesses silent and police ineffective. And he established the principle that would define the American Mafia for decades: loyalty to the organization above all else, enforced through violence so brutal it became its own deterrent. Today, tourists walk past 352 East 116th Street without knowing that it was once a crime scene, the place where America's first mafia boss died in a pool of blood. The 107th Street neighborhood where Morello built his empire has changed. Gentrified, diversified, bearing little resemblance to the crowded tenements where Sicilian immigrants spoke in dialect and feared the Black Hand. The saloon at 8 Prince Street is long gone. The counterfeiting operations, the barrel murders, the extortion rackets, they're history now, stories told in books and documentaries, artifacts of an era when the mafia was new and untested. But the structure Morello built remains. The Genovese family still operates, though in diminished form, prosecuted relentlessly by RICO statutes and federal task forces that Morello never had to worry about. The other 4 families, Gambino, Lucchese, Colombo, Bonanno, all trace their organizational DNA back to the model Morello established. Even the modern mafia's emphasis on legitimate business fronts for money laundering echoes Morello's Ignaz Florio cooperative. Giuseppe Morello died violently, as most mafia bosses do. But he lived long enough to see his creation outlast him, to see the 107th Street mob evolve into something larger and more enduring than one man with a deformed hand and a criminal education from Corleone. He brought the mafia to America. He gave it structure, strategy, and a code of conduct. He showed that immigrants dismissed as peasants and day laborers could build organizations powerful enough to challenge banks, politicians, and police. And he paid the price for that power, dying in a war he'd helped start, killed by men who'd learned their craft from watching him operate. That's the legacy of the clutch hand. Not the deformed digits that marked him from birth. Not the murders or the counterfeiting or the barrels stuffed with dismembered corpses. The legacy is institutional. The first mafia family in America. The template for organized crime that would shape New York for a century. The proof that crime, when organized with the discipline and ruthlessness of a military campaign, could become an empire. An empire built on fear. An empire maintained through violence. An empire that Giuseppe Morello, born in Corleone in 1867, with a hand that looked like a claw, created from nothing and left behind when 2 gunmen walked into his office on a Friday night in August 1930 and ended his life with a dozen bullets. The first boss of the American Mafia didn't die of old age or natural causes. He died the way the job description required. At the hands of rivals who understood that in the world Morello created, power is never given. It's only taken. And it's always temporary. The only question is whether you see the end coming, or whether, like Giuseppe Morello counting cash in an unguarded office, you believe you're safe right up until the moment the door bursts open and the shooting starts.